Welcome to the Maintenance Mavericks podcast, where we talk about trends in maintenance, reliability, and asset operations. My name is Ryan. I'm the CEO of UpKeep. And for today's guest, I'm super excited to welcome back my very good friend, George Parada. A little bit about George. He started his career in mechanical engineering, but found himself getting involved in maintenance and reliability. Over the past several years, he's helped various businesses improve their reliability as he's worked in a number of roles. George works at Meta, previously known as the one and only Facebook. George currently works as the Global Asset Management Quality and Reliability Engineer. So welcome back to the podcast, George. How are you doing today? How's it going?
I'm doing great, Ryan. Thanks again for having me. Always excited to talk and share with the community here a little bit about what we got going on.
That's amazing. And thank you, as always, for coming back onto our show and sharing, all of the knowledge experience that you've had in this space, in our space. So you and I know each other very, very well, but, some of our listeners, new listeners may not. So, would love to pass the baton over to you. Have you share a little bit more about how you were first introduced into this field of maintenance reliability, and kind of what has your journey been like?
Yeah, happy to. So as you mentioned, mechanical engineer, just right out of school, and went to go work in an operations process where I actually started in operations, and I quickly realized some of the challenges that we were having from a maintenance perspective to meet what the customers expected of us. And so I got the opportunity to actually run our maintenance department at the plant that I was working at. And very quickly, I developed a passion for this, areas of maintenance, for these areas of reliability, where I got to navigate, through my career, my first job, and then eventually find myself over at Meta, to just really look to understand how do we just define processes that can ultimately just yield, reliability objectives, and just drive some of these things, across the plants that I got to work at, the people that I got to work alongside. And ultimately, I wanted to just share this across the board, so, you see a lot of things that I like to share, on LinkedIn, because I definitely want to make sure that we can leverage best practices. So lots of learnings and lots of sharings that I've always wanted to do, throughout my career.
All right. And thank you for, being so open, because I feel like, especially the times that we're in, where we're still, at least for our industry, still working in these physical environments, amount of knowledge sharing is not as much as it could. And, these types of conversations really help up level everyone, different organizations, different industries. So really appreciate you being so open about sharing all of your experiences, George. I wanted to focus today's conversation on, kind of what your role is over at Meta, and the impact that it has to everything from reliability to sustainability to energy efficiency. George, I know that your role is primarily focused on cooling infrastructure in data centers over at Meta. Your role is maintenance reliability manager for all of global operations. Why don't we kick things off with data center cooling? What is it? Why is it necessary? How does all of this tie back into maintenance and reliability?
I'll be honest with you, before coming to Meta, I was not privy or even just aware of how expansive this industry was. My data center and in my days in the past, it was just a small closet that had just a couple of racks for compute and storage for all the equipment that we had to operate. Now, if you kind of multiply that by several hundreds of thousands, you realize how important critical cooling is. And so if I can simplify it, even just think about the computer, for those of us that have PCs and Macs, and not even the laptops, but the actual the desktop units, right? These things are putting out quite a bit of heat. And as we've scaled, there's a lot more gaming, there's a lot more AI. This requires some very some very important cooling infrastructure to ensure that equipment can essentially operate at the reliability that it requires. So as I think about data centers, it's ensuring that from a reliability, from a safety, from an environmental perspective, that we don't allow those the functionality of those equipments to fail. So it's absolutely important that we can remove the heat from this equipment, in this case, compute and storage racks, as quickly as possible. There's a couple of ways around how data centers typically operate. The more preferred method is what's called a hot and cold aisle layout. So if you were to think about a data hall, you're going to have these sets of racks that are going to be basically in lanes, okay? So the output of the heat is what you want to capture. So the cooling that's going to be coming into the actual cold aisle is what you want to be, is where you're forcing in like the cooling from like your cooling infrastructure. And then you want to expel the heat that's coming out from the hot aisles. And typically like these are captured in what's called like hot aisle containments. And so you're basically trapping that heat, so then it doesn't maintain within that space, and you want to expel it, exhaust it out of like that data hall, and either eventually out of the data center, or there's an opportunity to also like reutilize like that heat that you've captured and perhaps like recycle it. And it's really important that that exhaust air is I'm sorry, not the exhaust air, but that the air that is being maintained within that space is anywhere in that 65 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So you're talking about some very targeted temperatures so that compute and storage equipment can operate at an optimal level.
I mean, that's so fascinating. I mean, we were kind of talking about this right before we hit record, but like I was actually very surprised when I first learned about like how important cooling was to a data center, and how important it was not just to reliability, but also the efficiency of running a data center. Would you say that the cooling aspect of running a data center, like how does cooling relate back to reliability?
When you talk about cooling, you want to make sure that in this case the racks and the servers are operating at optimal temperatures. Okay, so that means that you have some reliability targets that you're trying to achieve by that compute and storage equipment operating at a target temperature. Now, the minute that the operating envelope falls outside of whatever those target temperatures are, you're basically not meeting like your operating targets. And so to me, how I tie that back to reliability is that how do I make sure that that equipment that is cooling those compute and storage assets are basically putting out like the amount of cooling that is necessary. Now, that may mean that those things are operating either too high, not enough, perhaps like high energy costs. And so, one of the things to like really consider is that how do I make sure that I'm meeting and I'm getting the cooling that is required? The minute that doesn't do that, then I'm basically impacting operations and ultimately like impacting the reliability of that compute and storage equipment.
Yeah.
So we can make the comparison to anything else, just like if we're looking at a car, once that car starts to overheat, the reliability of the asset or of that vehicle that, I know in your case, that UpKeep Tesla that you have, or actually, actually it's an electric car. that example, right? But maybe for my case, like my vehicle, right, that is a gas powered vehicle. I'm impacting the reliability of that. Same thing for like that compute and storage equipment. So that reliability is drastically impacted.
You did a lot of your career in food bev, which has some great maintenance reliability practices, and now you're over at Meta, which I'm guessing has like a different unique set of challenges too. Be curious, like what are some of the latest like innovations, techniques that are really changing the landscape of maintenance reliability, relative to what you've seen in different industries like food and bev?
Yeah, the one thing that I would say that is uniquely different in Meta is really just like this whole concept of like hyperscaling, because this data center industry, and I'm sure you've heard about in the news, it is just taking off. And especially now with the whole metaverse, there is that much more need for for data centers, for compute and storage equipment, to make sure that we can just manage and just handle like this high level of traffic outside of just like the social media platforms that we have. And so that was, I would say that was new to me. But the one thing that I would say that stays consistent is asset management is asset management.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's important to just realize, how do we just apply those principles? Let's say in my case, what I was able to learn in food and bev and apply it over here. And as it relates to like innovative and techniques, what a lot of these companies are like looking at, such as Meta, Google, and some of these other hyperscalers, is that how do we just like minimize energy consumption and still meet those reliability objectives around around the cooling, around like the output of this compute and storage equipment. There's a lot of just looking at, hey, how do we just look at what are some of these additional chips that we're starting to install, ensuring that the high performance computing targets are being met. I talked about like the reusing of heat. Is there an opportunity to like reuse the heat that is coming out of like these racks, and make that more of a closed loop system? And there's also something that's been out there for a little while, but it's starting to be more utilized around like direct liquid cooling. Again, not a new concept, but it's really gained a lot of popularity and an accepted cooling method as we think about high performance computing. Again, something that we really need right now, as you have like AI, you have, what's coming with the metaverse, a lot of just high computing power that is required for these areas within data centers. And one of the reasons why that direct liquid cooling is really optimal is because these tend to have like a pretty good return on investment of like less than a year, because it really provides like significant savings over time. And it's actually like very, very direct cooling to like those equipments that you're using within the compute and storage assets.
Oh, that's super interesting. And you also mentioned like reusing the heat that comes out of these data centers. Like, are we currently reusing that heat, or is it just kind of getting expelled into the air?
Yeah, it really depends on the data center layout, but there is a combination where a lot of organizations are currently like reutilizing that heat, but most of it then is just being expelled. So it's really just how their loops are set up within the cooling infrastructure to reutilize like that heat.
Yeah. I mean, it's so fascinating because, and I'm making a lot of assumptions here, George, but my guess is like food bev, the practices have been around for a very, very long time. And, what you're kind of mentioning and, the hyper scaling of data centers is actually a much more recent phenomenon with, obviously, the move to cloud over the last, decade, 2 decades. Everything from the metaverse to like, even now I'm guessing Bitcoin mining and all the different, cryptocurrencies that revolve around essentially like massive data centers. So like my guess is over the next 10 years from now, we're going to see this like, I don't know, next level of maintenance reliability as it applies to data centers. And the innovations that we're going to see, my guess is going to be, something beyond what we could even imagine right now.
Yeah, and I mean, even like how Meta, or even back in the day, Facebook started, we were renting a small space in what's called like a co-location data center. And we didn't realize that we were going to need eventually to start building our own data centers. And so that is available to like a lot of companies today, where, a lot of like new companies are starting to say, hey, like we're going to like rent our space. So then if you want to, utilize it for your small little metaverse, for your Bitcoin mining, like whatever it is, we can go ahead and make this space available for you for your data center needs, your compute and storage needs. So that is an area that we still utilize. We still use a lot of co-locations, a lot of smaller companies. That's what they do because they don't have the infrastructure to either build or set up their own data centers. So you're seeing a lot more of that. Again, and not just like where companies like Meta and Google, where they build their own, but there's other smaller companies that kind of build for just some of these other organizations that do need compute and storage requirements.
So you and I just kind of talked about like it's going to be so difficult to predict the future and what kind of innovations will happen in the future. But I also want to ask you, George, like, is there anything you're excited about in the future, as it relates to maintenance reliability and the kind of like hyper growth, some of the challenges that we may not even, some of the new challenges that we're starting to see as a result of this like hyper growth, hyper scaling of these data centers. So like trends, technologies, future.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts there, Ryan. First and foremost, obviously sustainability is a big thing out there, right? For us, like we've really been evaluating investing, like where do we have opportunities for zero carbon emissions? How do we start to minimize our water consumption, energy consumption, and start to produce and build data centers that use less energy? And how do we become more water efficient? So that's like one thing. The other challenge that I see on your question is the impacts of supply chain, because with more data centers, the hyperscaling of data centers, that means can the industry keep up with providing like the equipment that's required to build these data centers? All of these large critical cooling systems, the electrical infrastructure that's going to help us stand up these data centers, and then the resources to be able to do that. So that's one of the things that is top of mind, at least like in our organization, around how do we partner with the industry really to be able to meet our supply chain needs over the next 5+ years.
I mean, that's such a, obviously very timely, very relevant topic given the supply chain issues right now, the chip shortage, and ultimately, what is a data center? It's these chips that right now are stuck on the ports of Long Beach.
That's right.
What about your thoughts on like, we kind of talked about like technology and how the push towards cloud compute is going in the future. How do you feel like asset management strategies and tools are going to evolve in the future?
Yeah, like honestly, it really comes down to just right sizing the maintenance for this, ensuring that we have really sound business processes around how we're going to execute the maintenance. For us, really just kind of starting to think about like total cost of ownership. So whether it's you're utilizing your SAPs, your Maximos, your UpKeeps, like whatever those systems are, to be able to have like a good understanding of like what the performance is of your assets. What are your areas of opportunity from a reliability perspective, right? So when I think about what are the areas to like continue to look at, is just to ensure that there's just sound change management in place around how you're managing your assets, ensuring that the people out on the shop floor, so like in our case, it's like the engineers, the technicians at the data centers, that they're able to do like the right level of maintenance and have good visibility to the performance of those assets. Again, this is something that I would expect, whether we're talking about data centers, whether we're talking about like operating, in oil and gas plants, food and beverage plants, just a continued focus on that. And I think, we need to leverage, the communities that are out there to like learn from each other and share best practices.
Again, tell you this a million times, George, I really appreciate you jumping on these podcasts that we do, because that's exactly what it's all about. It's sharing best practices from one industry to another, from one company to another. We're all in it together. Like, this is us pushing the entire industry forward. So again, George, really appreciate you sharing all of your knowledge around this topic. What we always do as part of this show is do a quick fire set of questions to leave our audience with a few extra golden nuggets of information. So if it's okay with you, would love to get into this quick fire round with you. Basically, I'll ask you a question, get your thoughts and response in 20 seconds or less. How does that sound?
Let's do it.
All right. What's the best piece of advice a mentor ever gave to you about the maintenance reliability industry?
It is people enable processes. So very important that you engage your people in the processes that are executed. And then comes the automation and the technology of the tools.
Yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. I think that, too often we forget the people aspect of it, but we always say is our business is just a collection of people at the end of the day. On that note, what is something that you wish more people knew about the maintenance reliability industry?
It's probably really around like what we've been talking about, that there is a community out there that we got to tap into. And again, to your point that you were just sharing around sharing best practices, we have to just learn from each other, and we may initially have a lot of withdrawals, if you will, from that community, but let's also look to see how we can make some deposits and just share what we're learning along the way. And you don't have to be in a senior role. I mean, there's learnings that you have, even as a young engineer, a young, asset management leader. So definitely, make yourself aware of that community and invest.
Absolutely. Could not agree more, George. How about a mistake that you've learned from in your work history?
Like that's a question in interviews that tends to stump people. And for me, I would say like I'm learning all the time. I make mistakes, and I would say ensuring communication is always like up to the point that it needs to be. A lot of the reason why projects and efforts fail is because of a lack of communication. So ensure that you're over communicating where necessary. That's something that I've learned from, where I assumed that people were aware of something that I wanted them to do, and I just had not clearly communicated to them.
Mhm.
I just make sure that I'm continuing to focus on my communication out and ensuring that it's clear to folks.
Yeah, I mean that ties really nicely back to people enable process. Like the communication layer is so important because again we're dealing with humans and people and not robots and just computers. So what are some resources that you learn from on a day-to-day basis to stay up to date and challenge your thinking and explore new ideas?
So one would be like just like the people around me, like in my place of work. I would say I'm consistently learning from their experiences,
Hmm.
from the industries that they come from. We hire a lot of people from different industries, Brian, at Meta. So I'm always listening. I'm always understanding how do we maybe adopt this, for our organization and tailor it, if you will. And then just to kind of take the blinders off for a minute too, I would say LinkedIn. Like I learned a ton just from just scrolling and just reading posts, saving articles, sharing articles, like with my peers. So lots of great information out on LinkedIn. I love the community around just reliability and asset management that's out there.
I mean, it's a small but mighty community, and we're all grateful to have you as part of it too, George. What about the biggest takeaway that you hope our listeners are going to take away from today's discussion?
That asset management can really exist anywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, you made the connection there around like reliability to like cooling systems. It could even be in our vehicles when we're driving them to work and understanding, how they should be performing and, what kind of maintenance that they specifically need. Asset management just touches so much in our day to day, whether it's in our personal lives or at work. So I would say just keep that in the back of your mind and just think about how you learn an asset management lesson in your day to day.
I love that. All right. Lastly, George, can you share with all of our listeners the different ways that they can connect with you and follow you on your journey?
Like I mentioned earlier, LinkedIn is a community that I tap into, invest. So that's probably like the best way to stay connected. Like reach out if we're already not connected on there. I'm happy to share best practices and also like learn from you as well.
All right. Thank you again, George, for joining us. Thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in to today's episode of the Maintenance Mavericks podcast. Again, my name is Ryan. I'm the CEO and founder of UpKeep. You can connect with me. I'm super active, as George is, on LinkedIn. You can also shoot me an email directly at ryan@upkeep.com. I hope you all enjoyed today's conversation and look forward to connecting with you all soon. Until next time, thank you again, George. Have a great rest of the day.
Thanks.